Good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to the 9th Dorothy Thompson Lecture on Civil Rights. I had the very distinct pleasure of knowing Dorothy Thompson well and working with her a lot. She, as a university attorney, probably found me to be her most prolific client through the term of her service in that capacity. And I've got to say that Dorothy was the epitome of basic fairness in everything she did and in the way that she looked at the world. And Dorothy was a lawyer's lawyer. And the thing that I appreciated probably most about Dorothy is that she understood the civil law and she understood the canon law. If you think of a university as having an extensive canon law, which it does, Dorothy understood all the nuances of both and how they fit together in a context of treating people well. And so this lecture series could not be more fitting, nor could it be better designed than to honor that. With me on the stage are Dr. Jane Rolette, who co-chairs this series, along with Cheryl Strecker, who many of you know is the proud parent of a new baby daughter. And with that, again, I welcome all of you here, and I'm now going to turn the podium over to Dr. Charles Reagan, Executive Assistant to the President, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a special honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Kerry Kennedy Cuomo. And it's a pleasure and also a personal honor for me to participate in this Dorothy Thompson lecture series. Like Jim, I knew Dorothy well in her capacity as director of our Affirmative Action Office and also as a university attorney. And these are two offices with which I work very closely on virtually a daily basis. I see in these offices Dorothy Thompson's traces everywhere. Her fairness, her calm, dispassionate dialogue, deep concern for the rights of individuals, respect for institutional methods of resolving conflict, and an incredibly keen grasp on the philosophy of law and how it applies in particular situations. She and I had many discussions in the fine points of the philosophy of law. Dorothy Thompson left her mark on me personally, and she certainly left her mark on this university. And this lecture series is just one small tribute that we pay to her memory. Tonight's speaker, Kerry Kennedy Cuomo, has been working in the field of international human rights since 1981. She is currently working as a radio correspondent for the Voice of America on issues of human rights. She has lectured throughout the United States and has led human rights delegations to many countries in the world. Until last year, Ms. Kennedy Cuomo served as executive director of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial, a nonprofit organization which addresses the problems of social justice in the spirit of her late father. As the executive director, she supervised 3 programs: the National Juvenile Justice Project, which helps cities create more effective and less costly programs for dealing with young offenders; the RFK Journalism and Book Awards, also known as the Peoples Pulitzers, which recognizes those authors and journalists who prod our conscience and expose the problems of the dispossessed; and also the RFK Center for Human Rights, which she founded in 1988. She is a prolific writer whose articles have been published in major newspapers and journals in this country. She is co-chair of Amnesty International Leadership Council, and is a judge for the Reebok Human Rights Award. She also serves on boards of many foundations and committees concerned with the promotion of human rights around the world. Ms. Kennedy Cuomo is a graduate of Brown University and Boston College School of Law, and she's a member of the Massachusetts and the Washington, D.C. Bar Associations. She and her husband, Andrew Cuomo, are parents of twin girls, Kara and Mariah, and it is our pleasure and honor to have as a guest of Kansas State University this evening the Dorothy Thompson Speaker on Human Rights, Kerry Kennedy Cuomo.
Thank you. As Saddam Hussein said to the UN inspectors, "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." Carlos Mavrolian taught me how to use a camera. When we were in college, his infrared photographs fascinated and delighted me, and his enthusiasm for photography was infectious. Carlos spent much of the Russian-Afghani war in Afghanistan. And last August, Carlos became the first journalist to infiltrate the factories in Afghanistan, which the US military bombed in retaliation for the terrorist attacks in Africa. When Carlos crossed the border from Afghanistan to Pakistan, he was detained, interrogated, accused of being a spy, and arrested and then thrown into prison. And when he finally gained release, he met his colleagues from 60 Minutes at his hotel. And he told them about the evidence he'd uncovered, and he said he'd meet them for dinner to discuss the findings in more detail. But Carlos never reemerged from his room. Several hours later, they found his body slumped in a chair. I don't know if Carlos was the target of foul play or if his great, great heart just gave out. I do know that he was a brave man and a gift from God and a journalist. So tonight I would like to devote my remarks to my friend Carlos Mavrolian. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about the role of the journalists and of photojournalists in our world and in human rights. Journalists are now under fire more than at any time in the past. When war broke out in the former Yugoslavia, the first group targeted weren't the Croatians or the Serbs or the Muslims. The first group targeted was the press. 46 journalists were killed there. But not only in crossfire, a horrible but well-known risk faced by war correspondents. Throughout the war, members of the press were deliberately sought out and assassinated by snipers, and of the 46 killed, over half of them were photographers and cameramen. Ron Habib was the first photographer to document ethnic cleansing there, and his series of images depicted a Muslim husband and wife as they were crossing the street. The first picture was them crossing the street, and you saw 3 Serbian commandos looking on. And the next image of the wife is of the wife desperate, kneeling over her husband who's just been shot. And the third is of the wife and the husband shot dead, and one of the Serbian commandos with his leg on top of one of their faces, about to stamp on it. Habib was threatened with death when those pictures appeared, and today he is still unable to return to Bosnia. As one Serbian military leader put it, quote, "I will drink his blood," unquote. On December 24th, 1997, Turkish officials convicted Ayten Öztürk for violations of the penal code because she published and edited the leftist journal Kurtuluş. She was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison. Ozturk is not alone. Turkey has a history of persecuting journalists under the Penal Code and the anti-terrorism law, which defines non-governmental accounts of the Kurdish conflict as criminal offenses. One pro-Kurdish journal had 246 cases pending against it over the course of a single year. Last year, worldwide, 129 journalists were imprisoned. 29 of them went to jail in Turkey alone. In 1994, Altaf Faktu was kidnapped in retaliation for his coverage of the separatist movement in Kashmir, India. Undaunted, upon release from its captives, Faktu returned to reporting. Continuous death threats failed to silence the journalist, and then militiamen finally stopped him in his tracks on January 1st, 1997, with an assassin's bullet. Last year, 7 journalists were deliberately killed in India. Worldwide, 36 journalists were murdered. At least 26 of the 36 were politically motivated homicides. And last year, Algeria remained the most dangerous place in the world for journalists. The Armed Islamic Group, a terrorist organization fighting to overthrow the government, has claimed the lives of 59 journalists since the start of the war in 1992. As a matter of policy, the AIG seeks out and murders journalists as arms of the secular state. Then they put out a press release claiming responsibility for their brutality. As the Armed Islamic Group put it, those who fight with the pen shall die by the sword. The press is under attack. Homicide is now the leading cause of job-related injury in the profession worldwide, and the press most under attack are local journalists. Local journalists risk imprisonment and torture and death for the basic rights which most of us are lucky enough to take for granted. The right to shoot a picture, the right to print something in a newspaper, the right to express themselves freely. They have rejected the role of passive spectator, victim of political or social status quo, pawn of events, and have chosen instead to engage in a personal battle to change in some small or substantial way the history of their countries. In much of the world, the line between journalists and human rights activists is blurred, and for many, the only hope for victory and ultimately survival is exposure. Human rights activists and local journalists are often the only force standing between ordinary people and the misuse of power by the state. So today, I urge the journalists among you to use your talents to investigate, record, and expose abuses around the world, and perhaps most importantly, help local groups do the same. Journalism influences public opinion and therefore foreign policy, and inevitably who lives and who dies. There's an apocryphal notion, I think, that journalists stand at the sidelines and record events as they sail past, never deigning to really become involved. They are sort of thought of as above the fray, maintaining their objectivity at all costs. I don't believe that's probable, and I don't believe it's desirable either. And certainly, the very best journalists pursue concerned journalism. That is the notion of an involved journalist, one who makes a concerted effort to depict the human condition in all of its agony and all of its glory. And to do that, one cannot be aloof. You have to be involved. Journalists aren't like those video cameras at the 7-Eleven behind the counter which record over and over what is happening ad nauseum. Great journalism demands an angle. And today, journalism has multiple roles. Some photographers are used by tyrants to depict their countries and regimes in the most favorable light and to help maintain that imbalance of power. Who could forget the South African Tourist Board's image of dancing natives in happy homelands during the height of resistance there. And similar images depict indigenous populations in Kenya and Burma and Indonesia today. Round-the-clock surveillance photography is employed in whole neighborhoods of Northern Ireland. In China and Tibet, the government hires photographers to record demonstrators for identification and later arrest. And on July 17, 1996, the United States Senate convened hearings on the CIA's use of journalists for intelligence operations. So while governments use photographers and other journalists to create their point of view, photographers must challenge that perspective. There was this wonderful Peruvian group called TAFOS that realized that if they didn't take photographs, their stories would never be told. So TAFOS defied both the shining path and the military and recorded abuses in the country during martial law. They now have an archive of over 1 million images of the atrocities that happened in their country. And they have been carried from town to town, engaging people and asking them to add their own stories and photos of the events. The archive is now buried in a secret place as evidence of those atrocities. In Guatemala, still photographs of beatings of street children helped bring a halt to the cruelty and the murders. Pictures were submitted to the Inter-American Commission and the UN Committee on Torture and were used to prosecute torturers. And just yesterday, one of those torturers was found guilty. Deputy Chief Prosecutor for the War Crimes Tribunal in the former Yugoslavia, Graham Blewett, spoke about the power of news photographs in his work. He said, "We all identify with things we see rather than things we only hear about. It's important to be able to visualize. It's one thing to listen to evidence, it's another to see what that evidence is all about." In Rwanda, photojournalist Reza and others took it upon themselves to document hundreds and hundreds of missing children. And then there was kind of a barn that was left still standing, and they came with push pins, and they put all the photographs up on the walls of this enormous barn, and then parents walked through looking for their children, and they were in that way able to identify families and reunite them after years of war. So I think this becomes a challenge to all of us, for those of us who are journalists, to take up the mantle of participatory journalism, and those of us who benefit from journalism to watch out for those people who do, and to teach and to train local groups and to become part of the call for a more decent society. The challenge to maintain objectivity about the facts and truth, while never disengaging from the human beings who are suffering, has been faced by human rights organizations. And through years of work by groups like the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights and the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights and the Committee to Protect Journalists, human rights groups have earned a reputation for objectivity and high, uncompromising standards and impartiality, rather similar to journalism. Today, human rights groups are moving to employ those same standards, but for explicitly partisan purposes. How to maintain the standards, but use the material generated to advocate for human rights is a challenge we face daily. Journalists can play a vital role in facing that challenge by documenting abuses and by helping local groups record them. Photographs can change the world's perspective on an event or a government. The execution, I know how many of you here remember this photograph of the execution of a Viet Cong by the chief of police of Saigon. How many of you remember that picture? See, look at all that, amazing. That execution was so clearly calculated and brutal that the photograph became a symbol in the United States for what was wrong with our involvement in Vietnam. Eddie Adams' picture changed the popular American perspective on our allies, and therefore on the war. And it set the stage for Nick Utt's picture 4 years later of Kim Phuc, who is the little girl napalmed, screaming in pain, and running in utter agony down a dirt road. She was so much a victim of the suffering visited on the innocent that that picture again changed our image, but not of our allies, our image of ourselves. Adams' picture of the assassination and Utt's picture of Kim made it possible to criticize U.S. participation in that war and galvanized popular support for cessation of the fighting. No one understood better the power of those images than our own military. So much so that in successive military excursions, everything has been controlled by the Pentagon. In Grenada, only those photographers handpicked by the Pentagon could shoot pictures. And in Panama, photojournalists were locked in the barracks for days, for 4 days. 4. They totally missed the invasion. And there's one photographer called Patrick Cheval, who was coincidentally already in Panama, and he captured the invasion on film. His are virtually the only pictures of that war until he was wounded, but not by Noriega's forces, by U.S. forces. In Desert Storm, only the cleanest images were allowed past the censors. Ken Jarecki's shocking picture of a charred body after bombs had strafed retreating troops was banned from publication in the United States of America. We saw only a fraction of the reality of that war, and only what the Pentagon wanted us to see. The news magazines, TV, and papers cooperated rather than risk exclusion from the front. The Pentagon realized that photos have the capacity to expose human suffering and thereby ignite change. Derek Hudson's pictures of deformed children was the impetus for the Pentagon to admit bombing a chemical factory and using experimental drugs on U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Although some say the golden age of photography is long past, it is the power of the still to capture a point in time that has again and again galvanized popular support to force our government to change policy. I think of Susan Mazelis's picture of the shadows on the wall, of a line of Salvadorans, hands on head, shuffling off to be killed. And that repelled U.S. citizens. In turn, urged on by the church and the sanctuary movement, we demanded the withdrawal of our support for the military there. And when U.S. dollars stopped flowing, the military was forced to negotiate with the FMLN, and a decade of war came to an end. Sebastião Salgado's photographs of famine in Ethiopia helped arouse popular sympathy for the victims and galvanize public demands for action. Some years later, Jim Notchway's photos of Somalia had a tremendous effect on the U.S. decision to send troops. Examples abound of pictures that enraged, outraged, and engaged. Charles Moore's arresting pictures, images of the German shepherds mauling freedom riders during the civil rights marches, John Philo's image of the agony of Marianne Vecchio at Kent State, Gilles Caron's photo of a starving child in Biafra, Stuart Franklin's image of a lone Democrat defying a tank in Tiananmen Square. But what happens when there are no photographs? In Lubumbashi, Zaire, soldiers went into a dormitory where students had been striking. And in the middle of the night, they beheaded 50 kids. How many people have here heard of that massacre? I see one hand. One hand. Most people have never heard of it, and that's because there were no photographs, there was no documentation, and therefore there was no story. In the last month alone, 10,000 people are now lying dead in Badme. Badme is a town between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Who's heard of that? Nobody. In contrast, 3,200 people, according to the State Department, have been killed in 30 years of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. If there are pictures, if there are journalists there, there's a story and there's attention. No journalists, no one's ever heard of it. One can only imagine what life is like today for women in the wrong garb in Afghanistan. But without photographs, who knows? Bosnian Serbs got away with denying massacres of Bosnian Muslims until satellite pictures indicated fresh ground removal. A Christian Science Monitor reporter managed to follow the trail and reveal proof of the massacres. Photographs stopped them from getting away with murder, even genocide. There are photographers who have taken up the mantle of human rights in their work. People like Eugene Smith, who documented industrial environmental pollution in Minamata, Japan in 1971. When his stories of deformed children and moonscapes on Earth started appearing in Life magazine, the corporation responsible for the destruction took action. They sent thugs after Smith, and they broke his arms and his legs, and they nearly blinded him. Eugene Smith spent weeks in the hospital, and then he grabbed his camera and he went back to work, digging deeper and deeper into the cruelty and greed of Minamata. There are people like photographer, reporter Natsa Chaikova, the Russian journalist whose hard-hitting coverage of Chechnya and the use of special filtration prison camps to control the population was viewed as a threat by Russian authorities. Despite the obvious danger, Chaikova went back to the heart of the tensions in March 1996. One local official told colleagues who were searching for her to go look, he said, go look for her with the federal troops. She had a camera and was recording everything that they committed. She was found, beaten, blindfolded, forced into a kneeling position, and shot dead in the back of the head. And there are people like Peter Magubani. Peter is a good friend of mine, and he's one of the foremost photojournalists in South Africa. He was threatened, imprisoned, beaten, and tortured for covering the horrors of apartheid. The day after President Mandela's inauguration, Peter took me on a tour of Soweto, which is the black township outside Johannesburg where all black people had to live. And we remember one part of this just tour of this hellish existence. And there we walked up sort of in the middle of this little slum, and there was a little river, like a little creek sort of thing. And we saw all these kids playing in it and just having a ball. And there were maybe 5 or 6 children, and they were maybe 6, 7, 8 years old. And then we walked up maybe another 10 or 15 blocks, and we saw women upstream from the kids, and they were washing their clothes in the same water. And then we walked maybe another 500 or 600 yards, and we just saw raw sewage going right into the same water. After this tour, I turned to Peter and I said, you know, I think, of course, it's wonderful that Mandela has been inaugurated, but after looking at the devastation to this country that apartheid has left it in, what's really going to change? What will he really be able to change? And this is what Peter said, quote, "Never again will my house be destroyed because I pointed a camera. Never again will I spend 536 days in solitary because I took a picture. Never again will I take 17 bullets because I did my job." Hearing these stories, we must ask ourselves, why? Why do people face a house burning or have their limbs broken or take bullets or get thrown into solitary confinement for their work and then go out and do the work again? Do they do it because of a commitment to journalistic ethics? Or do they do it because they feel some sort of calling? Or because of divine intervention? In the Christian tradition, we place our prophets on pedestals and seal our saints in stained glass. And we raise them so far above us that we're no longer challenged we're no longer burdened by the challenge to our lives by their example and by their courage. But here on earth, there are people like Peter Malgubani and Eugene Smith and Susan Meiselas who are living, breathing human beings in our midst. And their determination and valor and commitment to noble causes in the face of overwhelming danger challenges each of us to take up that torch for a more decent society. They say you need not change the world, but you can do what you must in your own community, and that will make all the difference. And I would like to close with these words from Nelson Mandela. He said, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within all of us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. So tonight, let's let our light shine. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions, so if we could get some light on the house here, we'll open the floor for questions. Okay, you want to go to that microphone, and you can be next. Go ahead.
What keeps you coming to the middle of Kansas here and spreading this message, trying to make a difference when it's so hard to make a difference?
Well, I think the people who I work with, sometimes it's hard because the work that I do is, you hear about a lot of suffering. torture and rape and all sorts of the horror of humanity. But the people I work with are the Martin Luther Kings of their country. And, if Peter Magubani can spend all that time in prison and take 17 bullets and go pick up his camera and do his job, it's pretty easy for me to come out to Kansas. So,
Thank you.
yes.
I just have a question on the 50 kids that were decapitated. Where was that at?
That was in Lubumbashi in Zaire.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes.
This might take a little bit to put together.
Okay.
I've gotten about 5 emails on the Taliban problem with women,
Yes.
how they're being abused. And the question was put to me, do we have the right to interfere in another culture? I say, yes. We've been interfering in other cultures in a very negative way, this government has, for as long as I can remember. However, I don't believe that the way we've been interfering, or say we've been interfering in a positive light, like in Iraq, making war, is the right way to do it. What could you come up with, or off the top of your head, if that's where it would be coming from, as far as a suggestion as to how could a country like this do something for those women and the abuse that they're suffering without coming to the same type of interference that we always come to, which is sending in soldiers and then a lot of the civilians suffer? Because I don't believe that's the right way either. What is there to do, in other words?
What can we do about the Taliban short of sending in troops?
Or any human rights problem where it's very large.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I think on the interference issue, after World War II, the nations of the world came together and decided that how a country treats its own citizens is no longer only up to that country. And that under certain circumstances, not only do other countries, the rest of the world, have a right to go in, but we have a duty to go in when there are crimes against humanity taking place. We also, the UN also drafted the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and 2 covenants about those human rights. And those were signed by hundreds of countries. So when we demand that human rights be recognized and protected in most places in the world, that's not cultural imperialism. That's not the United States saying, these are our values and we're going to impose them on you. Most countries have signed those and say, we also believe that human beings should be treated in this way, that there should be a right to free expression, that women have rights as well. So that's something that we can set aside. That's an argument we can set aside for in most cases. Now, as far as the Taliban is concerned, I think the first thing we have to do is learn about it. And I'm so happy to hear that it's on the internet. Actually, this is the 4th question I've gotten today on that, and it just shows how great the internet is, that it's really working and raising awareness. At the end of this month, there is going to be a television program involving sort of every great actress in Hollywood, talking about what's going on in Afghanistan to women and what we can do as citizens to help. So I urge all of you to get onto the internet and tune into that program. But I think that there are many things that we can do. One is that we can bring pressure on the Afghani government. We can use carrots and sticks in both trade and aid. We can ostracize the Taliban from international organizations. and not allow them in. And we can support, most importantly, support the women who are there. There are lots of refugees coming out of Afghanistan who are now in Pakistan, and we can do a lot to help them and help their families. A lot of them have suffered tremendous trauma. I was talking this week to a woman who works with Afghani refugee women, and she said there are no psychiatrists there right now. So that's one thing that we can also provide in a very human type of way. I hope that answers your question. Yes?
I am concerned that the media these days, well, for many, many years, hasn't been at all sensitive to these kinds of issues. And is there any group that you're aware of at this time that's making an effort to put pressure on the media, particularly television, which I think is the medium that we're most aware of, to bring this kind of information to light rather than the kind of fare that we usually find on television at this time?
I'm not aware of any concerted effort. I think that there are individuals who do cover these issues, sometimes at risk to their lives and sometimes at risk to their careers. Christiane Amanpour, I think none of us would know what was going on in Kosovo without her being brave enough to go in there and expose it. And in many other situations, she's been right there. She's extraordinary. And I think there are some documentary filmmakers, Paul Fine comes to mind, who have a history of exposing these issues. Excuse me? Barbara Trent. I'm not aware of her, but that's another woman, I guess, who's working on some of these things.
But the decision is the leadership in the media that
Yeah.
then puts that out over the media. There are undoubtedly a number of very sensitive journalists and photojournalists and concerned journalists, but they can do an immense amount of work. There's a Annenberg School of Communications. There's a School of Communications and Journalism at University of Texas, School of Communications and Journalism here, but still, television remains trash.
Yeah, well, not going to argue with that. There is a group called the Committee to Protect Journalists, which works to, well, as it says, to protect journalists who are covering these issues worldwide. And that has a good group of powerful television and print media journalists based in New York. But I think there's not, I'm not aware of any concerted effort to sort of bring pressure on the networks per se to cover these issues. But it's a great idea. Yes? I think you have to go over to maybe he can ask and you can walk.
Actually, I have a question. This will work as a nice segue from the Barbara Trent allusion. Barbara Trent criticized the media, particularly PBS, as not being as public as it should be. That is, not that it was cowering to the pressures of corporate America, and that it wasn't being honest consciously. Do you agree with this?
I'm not aware of her
my
criticism per se. I didn't see what she said or what the context was.
My question is that...
Do I think PBS?
My question particularly, do you think that the media... You gave plenty of examples where media's influence hasn't been fully... that many events have not been recognized or known in the United States because of the inability of access to certain events.
Sure.
Now, do you think that there's some kind of impasse or blockade because of corporate influence or any other kind of just overall weakness of journalists? to be.
Yeah, I think that is perfectly clear that the networks depend on advertisers, and the advertisers don't want to, they'd rather pay more money for advertising on popular television shows than on serious journalism about atrocities overseas. I think that I don't think they have any trouble talking about that or admitting it, or I think they're perfectly straightforward about it. ER is more popular than the problems between Eritrea and Ethiopia. I agree with that. I think that's a problem. I think CNN has been better than most, but it's not as good as it could be.
I was just wondering, because most examples you gave of journalists who really wanted to strive to consciously whistleblow and uncover.
Yes.
But I just want to know if there were some instances where journalists weren't compelled to whistleblow.
We're not compelled to.
Yeah, well, particularly just because of like I said, corporate exploitation, corporate influence over the media.
I don't really understand. I'm sorry.
That's okay. For instance, Barbara Trent, she gave the example. She did a documentary on U.S. influence in Panama, the U.S. government intervention. She said that her documentary was going to be filmed on PBS, but it wasn't, and she excoriated PBS for not being as public as it should be because it wouldn't get financial backing.
No, I don't know. I'd have to look into that case. I don't know anything about it. Yes.
Well, first, thank you so much for giving us this global perspective about human rights all over the world. But you only mentioned one country in South America. And what about the other countries? I know it's a lot of problems there, and we know about the massacres. I particularly have seen some of those in Brazil and Venezuela, a little bit, not too much, but mostly in Colombia and Brazil because my traveling in those countries. And what about your experience in those countries too? You mentioned most in Europe, Afghanistan, you mentioned Arabic countries. And we lose the global perspective, Central America a little bit with Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti also. And what about your experience in South America? I mean, can you please elaborate a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
I'd love to. I've worked in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and actually I'm going to Colombia in a few weeks. As you may have read, there's been a series of atrocities in Colombia, particularly targeting human rights defenders there. And there are two important pieces of legislation that are in the Colombian process now and will be up in the next term starting in August, which we are going to try and get the president and legislators there to endorse. It would basically stop impunity by the military in Colombia, which has been responsible for committing so many atrocities. The important piece of legislation will make it so that members of the military who are accused of human rights violations are tried in civil courts instead of military courts, in hopes that this will stop some of the impunity there. This has been an important week for Central America. Finally, the United States, President Clinton said that we were wrong for supporting the military in Guatemala. That war resulted in 200,000 deaths. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about why he chose to make that announcement is because there was a wonderful nun, American nun, named Diana Ortiz. And Diana Ortiz comes from New Mexico. She was sent by her order to Guatemala in the 80s to do some work there. And she was picked up by death squads, and she was accused of being a terrorist, communist guerrilla, and she was gang raped and thrown into a pit full of rats, and she survived and crawled out, got herself to the city, and got back to America, and lived with that trauma for many, many years. And then she wanted to know who was responsible. So she went to the CIA and asked for the files, and they wouldn't give it to her. She went to the State Department. They had files on her, wouldn't give it to her. She went to the Pentagon and asked for her files on who had raped a U.S. citizen in Guatemala. And our government wouldn't tell her. Who were we protecting? Sister Diana Ortiz went on a hunger strike in front of the White House. And she got a lot of attention for that. And because of her sacrifice and because of her story, she was able to bring pressure on the U.S. government. And because of a few good people in the State Department and in the NSC, the National Security Council, we started opening up our files. One of the people who intervened on her behalf was Hillary Clinton. And the State Department was the first to turn over its files. The CIA has turned over some. The Pentagon has turned over some, not all of them. There's a lot of black marks on those files. So there's a lot of names and addresses and dates that have been blanked out. But as a result, really, of Sister Diana's work, she demanded not only her files, but the files of the 9 other Americans who had been tortured or killed in Guatemala, and then all the Guatemalans whose cases we knew about. And the United States government handed over some, not all of those files, to the Truth Commission in Guatemala. And based in part on that, they issued a report last week, or 2 weeks ago now, and President Clinton in turn issued an apology. So it's interesting because you might have read that in the news, that story, and you don't think how it happens. But it really, all of these things happen because there's some individual who's fighting for it and pushing it and just with dogged determination trying to get something done. And there are a few people in the government who are responding. So I think that's an interesting case in how things work. But this is an interesting time for Latin America, South America. Yes?
It appears to me that the internet may have great value in human rights in terms of a place to expose activities that are not what they should be. And I'm wondering if you would say a little more about the potential use of the internet as a way to let people know how countries are responding to human rights issues and what they're doing.
Well, it's true. The case of Afghanistan is just the latest in point, but there's the internet is being used by human rights activists around the world to issue reports and to expose the abuses they're finding. And now you can go, and I really urge, if any of you are traveling someplace, go on the internet first. Look up Amnesty International and look up the country you're going to visit. And then go to the State Department and look up the human rights reports for the country you're going to visit. And you learn so much that way. And there are other groups, Human Rights Watch, Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, of course the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights. And through that, you can get a very good picture of what's going on in that country. And one of the things that's also interesting to do is if you go there, or if you have friends traveling there, talk to people about what you've heard. And you will learn a lot from what they say, and you'll even learn more from what people are unwilling to speak about. The internet has played a very, very important role in this in the last few years. There's kind of a scary downside to it, though, which, of course, everybody who uses the internet knows. You have to use your judgment on what you can rely on and what you can't rely on. And, of course, there's tremendous potential for abuse out there as well. So it kind of has two sides to it. But as long as you're looking at sites of organizations which have a good reputation, you can learn a lot. Yes?
I'd like to, I had something else, but I have a question about Diana Ortiz.
Yes.
Besides an apology and some blacked out files, what else did she achieve for her tribulations?
That's what she's achieved so far for her tribulations, and they're not over.
Okay. Another question was about economic sanctions. You mentioned in the case of Afghanistan economic sanctions, and I haven't seen economic sanctions to work very well in most cases. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think if you ask Nelson Mandela or Archbishop Tutu or Peter Magubani about the impact of economic sanctions in South Africa, they have one unifying, harmonious voice, is that without economic sanctions, they'd still be under the apartheid regime. So I think in certain cases, economic sanctions have really been extraordinary. I know working on China, every year that the MFN vote came up, people were released and there was an easing of tensions in China. So the potential economic sanction made a big difference in our work. Of course, it wasn't systemic, which is the changes that need to take place in China. But still, people who were in prison were out, and then that's better than we're doing right now. So
I was thinking of the Muslim rights specifically. I just wanted to mention briefly, Barbara Trent made an incredible film on the Iran-Contra affair about 10 years ago. She won a prize for the Panama Deception, a large prize, I can't remember which one, which wasn't aired on only maybe on 2 PBS channels and wasn't aired anywhere else. And she got an Oscar. She's a dynamic filmmaker.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
If there are two more over there, maybe we ought to take them and call it good. Thanks.
My question is related to, you've been working with the civil rights action movement since 1981, and I was just wondering, what is your opinion on how far have we come on starting to make decisions based on civil rights alone and not on economical and political reasons behind, even though the political are related to the civil rights, but like I see a lot of the actions, they use the civil rights as kind of like a facade for what the real objectives are behind them, and they are purely economical. Do you think we are coming close to finally start taking decisions based on civil rights alone?
If Cuba had 2 billion people in it, do I think we'd be trading with Cuba right now? I think we probably would. I don't think that our foreign policy decisions are based on solely on human rights. I can't even think of any country where they're based solely on human rights. I think that we have the world is complex, and there are a lot of different issues with different countries, and human rights is one aspect of those. I would like it to be more prioritized. I would like it to be more front and center. I think compared to when I started, it's a lot better. but it's certainly not as strong as it could or should be, in my opinion. Yes?
I just wanted to ask about the case of the black journalist in Philadelphia, Mumia Abdul-Jabbar.
Yes.
Doesn't appear that he can get a fair review of his trial, and it doesn't appear that the original trial was wholly legitimate at all. What's happening with him? Because he's been in jail now for almost 15 years.
Yeah, no, I just got some information about his case. This is a death penalty case in Philadelphia. I think it's Philadelphia, right? I think so.
Yeah, Philadelphia.
Yeah. And he's just gone through he was just denied yet another appeal. So he is on death row. And that's one of the problems with the death penalty in America. Statistically, 1 out of every 27 people on death row in the United States is later found to have their sentence commuted or to have been innocent, to have found themselves there for some wrong reason, one way or the other. And that's scary. It's a tremendous burden on everyone's society to have that, to have the death penalty, and it's something that we fight against.
Well, what I'd like to know, though, is there anything being specifically done to prevent this miscarriage of justice? I know that a few years ago, I think it was 1995, there was a letter-writing campaign to Governor Ridge, and they postponed the sentence and said there was going to be a judicial review. And then the same judge that heard the case originally is doing the review. And this isn't justice. Obviously, it didn't work the first time.
Yes. I'm not aware of a specific campaign that's happening now, but if you're interested in that case in particular, I think if you go to the internet or if you look at Amnesty International, I know that Amnesty was working specifically on his case, so you could find out more specifically what's happening. There's also an organization called the Broder Bond in Pennsylvania, which is working very, very much on his case, very hard on his case. And you could get the latest update from them.
Thank you.
Yes.
Kerry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you all.
And thanks for coming.